The classroom was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that spoke louder than any words. It was the last period of the day at Westbridge High, a predominantly white suburban school where diversity showed up only in numbers small enough to be noticed, but not large enough to be felt. At the back of the room sat Amara Johnson, a quiet but determined black student who had always felt like her presence was tolerated, never celebrated. Amara had poured her entire being into her latest assignment, a 5-page essay for English class. For days, she had stayed up late, drafting and redrafting her words, weaving together her personal story with the literature they had been studying. It was more than an assignment to her. It was a piece of her heart, a mirror of her resilience, a testimony of what it meant to navigate a world that rarely expected excellence from someone like her. But that morning, when her teacher, Mrs. Whitaker, collected the essays, the air shifted. Mrs. Whitaker, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, had always regarded Amara with a peculiar mix of suspicion and dismissal. While other students' mistakes were corrected with patience, Amara's efforts were scrutinized as if they carried hidden intent. When Mrs. Whitaker skimmed through Amara's paper, her lips tightened. She set it aside, not with the casual care she gave to others, but with a firmness that carried unspoken judgment. By mid-afternoon, the rumors had already begun. The students whispered among themselves, their voices laced with amusement and disbelief. They said Amara must have cheated. They said there was no way she could have written something like that on her own. And when the bell rang and the papers were handed back, Mrs. Whitaker confirmed their suspicions without ever needing to say the word. Amara's essay wasn't returned. Instead, she was told it would not be graded until her authorship could be verified. For Amara, it felt like the ground shifted beneath her feet. All of her effort, her late nights, her courage in putting pieces of herself on paper, dismissed in one cold breath. She had seen this before, not just in school but in life. Excellence from a black girl was too often seen as impossible, suspicious, or undeserved. That night, Amara sat at her desk, staring at the paper she had photocopied for herself. The words stared back at her, alive with the fire she had felt when writing them. Yet now, they carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. They weren't just sentences anymore, they were a battleground. If she remained silent, her work would vanish into the pile of accusations. If she stood up, she would be forced to prove what should have been obvious all along, that her brilliance was hers alone. The following day, Mrs. Whitaker made her decision clear. Amara would not receive a grade unless she read the essay aloud to the class. The announcement wasn't just a demand, it was a spectacle. The students leaned back in their chairs, some smirking, some wide-eyed, all waiting for the show. To them, this was entertainment. To Amara, it was humiliation disguised as justice. As she sat in her chair, gripping the edges of her desk, Amara felt her chest tighten. She wasn't afraid of her words. She was afraid of what it meant to expose them to a room that had already judged her unworthy. Yet deep down, she knew this was her moment. Her essay wasn't just ink on paper. It was her truth, her defiance, her voice that could no longer be silenced. The day ended with her name written in bold letters on tomorrow's agenda, Amara's reading. The words looked like a sentence passed down by someone else, but Amara began to see them differently. They weren't just a challenge. They were an opportunity. That night, she stood in front of her mirror, essay in hand. She read aloud, not to practice, but to remind herself that her words carried power. Each sentence rose like a wave, carrying with it the strength of her ancestors, the resilience of her family, and the quiet determination that had carried her this far. She wasn't just preparing to defend her essay. She was preparing to defend her place in a world that constantly tried to push her out. The next morning, the school hallways buzzed with anticipation. Students who had barely noticed Amara before were now waiting to see if she would sink or soar. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes followed her as she walked into the classroom, filled with that same skepticism, that same refusal to believe. When the bell rang, the class settled into silence. Amara sat with her essay on the desk in front of her, the pages trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what they held. She lifted her chin, breathed deeply, and prepared to speak. This was no longer just about a grade. This was about dignity, about being seen, about proving, once and for all, that her brilliance did not need anyone's permission to exist. The classroom leaned in, the air thick with expectation. And just as Amara's voice broke the silence, steady and sure, the first line of her essay carried across the room like a spark ready to ignite everything around it. The moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. The first words left Amara's lips with a steadiness that surprised even her. They were not rushed, not mumbled, not hidden. They were delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had carried her truth for far too long to let it be questioned. The classroom, once restless with anticipation, grew still. The whispers faded. The smirks slipped away. Her voice filled every corner of the room. Her essay was not just about the book they had been assigned. It was about the intersection between the fictional world and her own lived reality. She wrote about characters who carried invisible burdens, and how those burdens mirrored the weight she bore walking the halls of Westbridge High. She wrote about being underestimated, overlooked, and accused of being less capable simply because of who she was. Each sentence braided together literature, history, and her own story in a way that no plagiarism could imitate. As she spoke, the words gained rhythm, almost like music. They carried the cadence of her ancestors' prayers, the echo of stories passed down through generations, and the fire of a teenager who refused to be invisible. She spoke about how resilience was not just a word on paper, but a daily practice, a choice to rise each morning despite knowing the world might push her down again. At first, some students exchanged glances, their eyebrows raised as if waiting for her to stumble. But she didn't. Her voice only grew stronger. The further she read, the more their eyes shifted, their postures changing from amusement to awe. Even the ones who had whispered doubts the day before now sat frozen, their expressions softened, their defenses lowered. And then there was Mrs. Whitaker. She sat at her desk, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on Amara with an intensity that betrayed her disbelief. She had expected hesitation, maybe even failure. Instead, she was confronted with brilliance so undeniable it silenced the room. Each line of the essay chipped away at her skepticism, forcing her to confront not just the student before her, but her own bias that had led her to this moment. Amara's essay spoke of injustice, not only in literature, but in the daily realities of students like her. She spoke of how classrooms often demanded excellence, but rarely nurtured it when it came from those who didn't fit the mold. She wove her personal journey with the themes of the novel, showing how oppression on the page mirrored oppression in life, and how resilience was more than just survival. It was transformation. Her words painted vivid images. The silence of being ignored when her hand was raised. The sting of being accused of cheating when she succeeded. The weight of feeling she had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good. These were not abstract ideas. They were raw truths, spoken aloud in a room that could no longer pretend not to hear. By the time she reached the final page, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What began as a forced performance had become something greater, a moment of revelation. The classroom no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a stage. The students weren't just an audience, they were witnesses. And Amara wasn't just defending her essay, she was claiming her voice. Her last paragraph tied everything together with precision. She spoke of hope, not as a fragile wish, but as a radical act of defiance. Hope, she said through her writing, was choosing to believe in your worth even when the world tried to deny it. Hope was the fire that kept her writing when no one believed she could. Hope was the reason she stood before them, unshaken, unapologetic, and unafraid. When the final word left her lips, the silence that followed was different from the silence that had begun the reading. This was not silence born of doubt or judgment. This was silence heavy with awe, a silence that carried the weight of recognition. For a moment, no one moved. The students sat in stunned stillness, the reality of what they had just heard pressing down on them. Amara lowered the paper to her desk, her hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the release of everything she had carried inside. Mrs. Whitaker shifted in her seat, her composed expression cracking ever so slightly. She reached for Amara's essay, as if seeing it for the first time, though the words had been hers all along. There was no denying it now. No accusation could erase what the class had just witnessed. Amara's voice was proof. Still, the moment was unfinished. Recognition from her peers was powerful, but Amara knew that true justice required more. She had read her essay. She had bared her soul. But would it be enough to change the perception of a teacher who had already branded her as less than? Would it be enough to alter the narratives whispered in hallways and carved into expectations? The bell rang, breaking the silence, and the room erupted with a quiet chaos. Backpacks zipped. Chairs scraped against the floor. But the usual chatter was replaced by hushed tones and lingering glances toward Amara. Something had shifted, though she couldn't yet tell if it was respect, discomfort, or both. Mrs. Whitaker held onto the paper, her knuckles white against the pages. She dismissed the class with a wave, but her eyes never left Amara. There was something unspoken in that gaze, something caught between admiration and guilt. For the first time, Amara saw her teacher not as untouchable authority, but as a flawed human being forced to confront her own prejudice. As the students filed out, some paused to look back at Amara, their expressions softer, their eyes holding something new. She gathered her things slowly, her heart racing with the weight of what had just unfolded. The battle was not over. The essay was read, but the grade still hung in question. Walking out of the classroom, she could feel the whispers following her again, but this time, they carried a different tone. Not mockery, not doubt. Something else, something she couldn't yet define. The hallway felt longer than usual, each step echoing with the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. Would her essay finally be recognized for what it was? Or would her truth be dismissed once again, buried under the weight of suspicion? She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Her voice had been heard, and once heard, it could not be silenced. And as she pushed open the door to the afternoon light, Amara carried with her the sense that this story was not finished. Something was coming, something that would test not only her words, but the hearts of everyone who had listened. The night after Amara's reading felt heavier than usual. She lay awake, replaying every word she had spoken, every glance she had caught, every silence that had followed her voice. Though she had read her essay with courage, a lingering fear crept in. Would it matter? Would it change anything? Or would her truth be swallowed once again by a system that had always been eager to doubt her? At the breakfast table, her mother noticed her silence, but said nothing. Amara's mother had raised her to understand the weight of being underestimated, the burden of proving yourself twice over, and the exhaustion that came with it. She didn't need to ask what was wrong. She could see it in her daughter's eyes. Instead, she simply touched Amara's hand, a quiet reminder that she carried more strength within her than she realized. By the time Amara arrived at school, the whispers had already started. But unlike before, there was a different energy to them. Students leaned against lockers, their voices hushed not with mockery, but with curiosity and even admiration. Some nodded in her direction. Others gave her glances that seemed to say, "We didn't know." For the first time, Amara felt that maybe, just maybe, her classmates had seen her as more than just an outsider. Still, the shadow of Mrs. Whitaker lingered. When Amara entered the classroom, the teacher's eyes followed her with a mix of calculation and unease. The essay sat on the desk, still ungraded, its pages slightly crumpled from being held too tightly. The weight of authority rested in that red pen, and Mrs. Whitaker had yet to use it. The class passed slowly, the tension thick. Finally, near the end of the period, Mrs. Whitaker called Amara to stay behind. The other students shuffled out, their eyes darting between the two, sensing the confrontation that hung in the air. When the door closed, the silence pressed down. Mrs. Whitaker picked up the essay, flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness. She spoke not with accusation this time, but with hesitation. Her words carried the stiffness of someone used to admitting they had been wrong. She confessed, in her own guarded way, that she had doubted Amara, that she had assumed brilliance like this could not belong to her. She said she had been wrong, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. She explained that when she had heard Amara's voice filling the room, she had realized the truth. No one could have written those words but the girl who stood before her. Then, slowly, Mrs. Whitaker picked up her pen and marked the essay with an A. The letter glowed red against the page, not as a symbol of charity, but as a reluctant acknowledgement of something undeniable. For Amara, it was more than a grade. It was vindication. Proof that her voice carried weight. Proof that her excellence could no longer be ignored. But Amara didn't stop there. She asked why her work had been doubted in the first place, why her intelligence had been treated as suspicion rather than possibility. The question hung in the air like a mirror Mrs. Whitaker could not avoid. For the first time, the teacher's composure cracked. She admitted what she had never said aloud, that she had allowed her own assumptions, shaped by race and expectation, to cloud her judgment. It wasn't an apology that could erase the hurt. It wasn't a confession that healed the wound. But it was a start, a moment of reckoning. And though it came late, Amara knew the importance of what had just happened. News of the confrontation spread through the school faster than any rumor before it. Students who had doubted her now spoke with admiration. Teachers who had overlooked her began to see her differently. And while not every opinion shifted, the ripple effect was undeniable. Amara's voice had broken through the walls that had kept her boxed in. Over the following weeks, she noticed the change. Her peers began asking her for help on assignments, listening when she spoke in discussions, and treating her not as invisible, but as someone to respect. Mrs. Whitaker, though still guarded, called on her more often, her tone softer, her gaze less suspicious. The wound of mistrust remained, but the scar carried power, a reminder that Amara had forced the world to see her for who she was. But perhaps the greatest transformation was within Amara herself. For so long, she had written quietly, unsure if her words mattered beyond the page. Now she knew they did. Her essay had not only earned her an A, it had sparked a shift in perception, cracked open a space where her brilliance could no longer be denied. She began to write more boldly, sharing her work beyond the classroom, entering competitions, even considering a future where her voice could shape more than just essays. One afternoon, as she walked home beneath the fading autumn sun, Amara thought about the journey that had brought her here. The late nights spent writing, the sting of being accused, the fear of reading aloud, the silence that had followed her last word, and the grade that had finally acknowledged her worth. She realized that while her essay had been about resilience in literature, the true lesson had been her own. Resilience was not just about enduring. It was about rising, about forcing the world to reckon with the truth of who you are. And though she knew the battles were far from over, she carried with her the certainty that her voice was a weapon, a gift, a light that could not be dimmed. The story of Amara's essay would linger in the halls of Westbridge High long after the paper itself was filed away. Students would remember the day a quiet black girl shattered their assumptions with nothing but her words. Teachers would remember the day their colleague was forced to face her bias. And Amara would remember the day she discovered her voice could not just demand respect, it could change the room. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara walked with her essay tucked in her bag, the red A blazing against the white page. But she knew the true grade was not in the ink. It was in the shift of hearts and minds. The whispers turned into respect, the silence turned into recognition. She was no longer just a student at Westbridge High. She was a voice that could not be silenced. And this was only the beginning.